like the eternal city that is Rome, where the ecclesiastical splendor of the Renaissance completely enthralls the imagination. The dome of St. Peter's rises upwards like a heavenly choir. From the topmost pinnacle, the centuries that are Rome spread out in everlasting significance.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the third day in a row we've done a podcast, and we have one tomorrow. Today, we're welcoming on Niwa Limbu and Henry Lithgow, both contributors to the Catholicism for Modern World website. It's good to have you all here.
Lovely. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
So we have a quote here. We'll bring this up. A monarch can be pragmatic, even lenient. A monarchist or a philosopher cannot. So what does that quote mean, Niwa?
Well, I got that quote really inspired by Joseph the Metz, the famous counter-revolutionary thinker at the time. And as we know, he could not return back from the 18th century, realizing the flaws of the Enlightenment and how the monarchy in France, the Ancien regime, had been destroyed, evidently. So he took inspiration while looking at King Louis XVIII, and even looking at sort of quasi-absolutists like King Charles X, and saying that they can be pragmatic, they can be lenient. Yet me, as a monarchist or philosopher, I cannot go extensive further to that idea of compromise, of course.
Yeah. So where do you want to start? What's the best topic to introduce us to the subject?
I think before we get into that, I've got some book recommendations. Let's get that out of the way before the Q&A asks that.
Yeah.
So one of the best books to look into Catholic monarchs, in my opinion, is this book by W.J. James, Habsburgs and Bourbons. It talks about the royalist families, the Catholic royalist families in Spain, France, and Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, and Austria, of course. It's an insightful book, actually. It's very historical, and it keeps true to its name. So another book, actually, linking to monarchism, but not really relating to monarchism, is The Outline to Heraldry. It's by Robert Innes Smith, and it's got a foreword by the Duke of Norfolk. I think this book is very special because it explains all the inward-out roles of what makes the monarchy special, the hierarchy that builds the monarchy. So naturally, it talks about the lords, the barons, the viscounts, of course, that make Britain a monarchy, really, and its inner tradition. And whether that be the traditions of Catholicism, such as the Duke of Norfolk or the old Salisburys, or whether the new sort of modern heraldry, such as the Lords of Westminster and like the Chamberlains of England. And the final recommendation for the Anglo readers, of course, is the Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution of France. We'll get onto this book later, but I think it's very important to mention this beforehand. My favorite quote, actually, is actually on the back of the book, the blurb. And it says, "To make a revolution is to subvert the ancient state of our country, and no common reason that are called to justify a violent proceeding." And this totally relates to how monarchy in Europe fell. It fell due to the revolution. And how can we counter this revolution is entirely dependent. And Edmund Burke, thinkers like Louis Bonald, Xavier, and Joseph de Metz also give good clinical answers.
So how did you become interested in the topic? Either of y'all.
Henry, do you want to go?
Well, sure, why not? Well, the way that I got introduced to monarchism, I feel like it had to have been just simply the inevitable conclusion to just the study of history. Because when you look at history, like altogether, you'll notice from the very, very beginning that societies and civilizations have always been governed by kings, and that is simply how, no matter what point you go in history, you'll find that for man, the rational conclusion as to how society should be governed is that there has to be a king or a monarch or something in between, whether it be like a prince, a duke, etc., etc. And so having like going and reading like about all these great kings throughout history, whether it be like pre-Christian kings like say Alexander, or you can also go and kings from like the age of Christendom like Constantine, Charlemagne, the Catholic
Mhm.
monarchs of Spain and Aragon, you naturally develop like I feel like when you look into it and and you study it thoroughly, you realize like how truly great these people were and how these people truly um you know truly cared about like their people, and they knew about the obligations that they had to God and the church. And it kind of reminds me actually of this quote by Charles Coulomb, actually, the famed monarchist writer.
Mhm.
And he talked about um, how he would much rather live under a king who knew like full well that he was going to go to hell if he failed to like, uphold like his duties towards the church and his people, than rather than like a president who only cares about, votes and just sees me as like a political tool. And I think really at the end of the day, that's kind of the best way to, you know, um, summarize that sort of view. And it also, the my interest in it also came into like also was like accelerated as I grew more in faith and I began reading more about the history of the church. And you'll notice like throughout all the church's history that the church has always endorsed like monarchy as like the form of government, as the natural form of government um, on earth. I mean, as our Lord Jesus Christ constantly talks about how there's like heaven is a kingdom, not like a republic. Like there's no republic in heaven. There's no democracy. There's not a president. It is a king. It is a kingdom. It has the King of Kings. So at least that's from like my view on it and how I got interested. So you can go now if you want, Limbu.
Well, monarchy, I live in England. God glorious England, Our Lady's dowry. So it's always been fascinating interest for me. I mean, even though we've got Anglican king now, God bless King Charles III, uh, what really fascinates me is how the intricacies and the relics of a Protestant monarchy, an Anglican monarchy, so resonates with the Catholic traditions and ideas, and it it just sort of all links to this idea of Christ and the church, really. And I was always interested in politics, as you may know, politics and philosophy.
Yeah.
And what really resonated with me, especially in politics, is true social conservatism. And this, as you may know, you can delve into sort of different political ideologies and whatnot. However, the concept of throne and altar conservatism, high Toryism in England, like you can call it, it really it really sort of linked with the idea of what is truth. The truth is tradition, naturally. We're inclined to tradition. And we learn truths by tradition. So it just sort of all links through there. And that's how I really got into the idea of monarchism. Now,
Mhm.
I'm not server, the stream itself, I think what'd be great now if we can sort of explain, me and Henry can explain what is monarchism, because of course there are many different types of monarchism, which I'm sure me and Henry can explain.
All right, go ahead. Take it away.
Well, I think that the topic of what is monarchism, like Niwa pointed out, it is a very broad topic. And so, like, to study it, you have to, like, go through, like, many different forms of it. And so I think that the best way to start is that monarchism at its very core is just simply the natural order in where there's a state that is governed by the monarch. And really, like, from there, you can branch off into many different forms of monarchy, because, like, how that is interpreted is basically the main um the main decide like difference. And so you can let's start off, for example, with absolute monarchy. And so in absolute monarchy, you have basically the monarch having complete and total authority um over the kingdom. And this is like, for example, one very perfect example of this is like King Louis the 14th in Spain in France, my bad.
Hmm.
And another example is like King Charles the First in England. And so in these like sort of instances, the king is like the sole person who decides like how the kingdom is to be run. Of course, he's going to have people who execute his will within the kingdom, but at the end of the day, everything like from top bottom emanates from him. And you know, and some people, and so throughout history, some people argued, well, yes, we can have the king must have authority, right? But some people argued that there had to have been like a sort of legislative body that sort of keeps the king in check, and also, is like supposed to be like an intermediary between the common subjects and the and the crown. And so as a result, we have like systems like of um, not entirely constitutional monarchy. I think the right way to put it would be parliamentary monarchy. Not
Hmm.
in, um, and so this is where like the king and the parliament have a sort of um, you know symbiotic relationship with one another, where the king acts as like the moral authority, right, and can um, you know, tell the parliament, well, I think that we should do this, this, and that. And it's up to you guys to decide how we do it. And I think one very good example of like a parliamentary monarchy would be what happened during the rule of King George III in Great Britain, as he was, unlike his predecessors of the Hanoverian dynasty, he sought to basically have the king play an active role in the affairs of state, and as a result, that led to him like having the ability to appoint and dismiss prime ministers, and having a overall say in how the British Empire was to be run during this time. And it turned out to be, even though he wasn't an absolute monarch, it still came to very positive results
Yeah.
by the end of his reign. And then finally, well, not finally, but in terms of this sort of spectrum that we're going off of, you have
Hmm.
the common, like modern day constitutional monarchies, which is the most prevalent form of monarchy today, at least in Christendom. Um, and these are basically like the king or the queen or the monarch, whatever, basically just simply is a figurehead. They don't have any real power whatsoever. Well, they kind of do because they have the royal prerogative, but that's like like the instances where they actually act upon that is very, very rare.
Hmm.
But overall, they're just simply there to be like as like a ceremonial figure. And so all the affairs of state are simply delegated to the governing body of the land, which in most cases is like a parliament, like in Britain and Scandinavian countries and whatnot. And then, you have like different forms of monarchy that are now part of this sort of dichotomy, where it's kind of like feudal monarchies, where um, which, to my knowledge, there's not really any left today. But it was basically the standard form of monarchy up until around the 16th, 17th century. Um, and it's basically where the king, of course, up top, and he has like a large amount of authority, but below him, sorry, he had, the dukes, the princes, the barons, etc., who also, enforced the king's will in their respective regions. And so in a sense, it was a sort of federalized system, like at least like in a very primitive concept of it. And so, um, as a result, the king and the different princes and nobility of the kingdom were able to have like a very constructive relationship with one another, as the king could overall, oversee the kingdom, while local matters would be delegated to said princes and barons and dukes and whatnot.
Hmm.
And I think those are overall like the main categories. What would you say, Niwa?
No, I would agree with your overall, well, mini soliloquy on describing how monarchies have evolved and what type of monarchies we've had. Uh, I think an interesting fact, I believe the last time the royal prerogative in England has been used was Queen Anne. And that royal prerogative was to veto a law, well, veto a bill, if
How
you're
long
doing
ago was that? How many? What century?
that was 18th century,
Mhm.
pretty sure. And that was to uh, veto a shipbuilding bill, which would have helped the Jacobite cause in Scotland. So, of course, I don't think for one second the Protestant Queen would have wanted a Catholic threat. Uh, I think one thing you forgot to mention, Henry, is what I wanted to go into next. Anyways, is that probably the only major traditional European monarchy left is the Holy See, the Vatican, of course. It's the
Mhm.
papacy in itself. So as we know, we call our Pope His Holiness. Pope Francis is His Holiness. And it's the name that what we would normally give to a king. I mean, we would agree that if I saw King Charles III right now, I would call him Your Highness. It all interlinks together. So I believe it was last year I did an article for the Catholicism for the Modern World website where I discussed the papal tiara and how its disuse made it evidently evidently made itself not a monarchy anymore. But I think the actual hierarchy of the papacy still is a monarchy. If you want to look at its sort of nature of the curia and how it's got the cardinals, the barons, and the seniors, the apostolic nuncios, they're all interlinked with the sort of idea of what a traditional monarchy is. So if I want to go further, actually, and let me discuss the original ideas. So if I believe due to this humanization of the papacy, uh, it destroyed many traditional things which we would uphold with a monarchy. And one of them is the Guardia Mobile Pontifica, the Pontiff Noble Guard, not to be confused with the Swiss Guard, of course. And their removal is a good example of the authoritative power of the Pope as a monarch to be removed. So created by Pope Pius the Seventh in 1801 as a regimental of heavy cavalry. It was personally the Pope's guard, and it was provided as a mounted escort for the Pope when he was moved about in Rome in his carriage, and the mountain guard would be outside his apartment in the papal palaces. Now, what makes these guards important is that they aren't regular people. No, these are Italian aristocrats. They come from every sort of family. The Orsini family. They come from the Milanese families. They come from people from Venice. I mean, they are all aristocrats protecting the Pope, because the traditional idea of His Holiness, the Pope, was that he is the one up top. He's the top dog of Italy, in essence, really. And that's why you see cases like Napoleon III, when he tried to nationalize Italy, when he tried to get all the states, the papal states, Venice, Sicily, to unite under Italy. He wanted that unity under the crown of the Pope. That's what people don't often realize. That people often say that he was a liberal, but to really appease the French Catholics, he wanted the Pope to be head, and that would mean the material head as well. That wouldn't mean, oh, he's just a figurehead. No, no, no. He would have replaced the Sardinian Italian monarchy. But no, that didn't happen, as you know, with, I believe it was Garibaldi who invaded and ruined Napoleon III's plans.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, it was Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel.
yes, it was. Thank you, Henry. And the noble guard was abolished by Pope Paul VI in 1970, I believe, as part of the reforms of the Church, of the humanization of the Second Vatican Council. So it was to remove the elitist image perceived in ceremonial corps, which was considered to be considered to be out of sympathy with a simpler, more inclusive era. So to link more with modernizing, linking back with European democracies. Now, another thing that links with this is papal regalia. So I've already mentioned the papal tiara. However, there are other such regalia that makes uh, that makes the actual monarchical image of His Holiness, and that can be seen whether that be through his crozier, but that can also be seen through his gloves, his papal ring, his fisherman's ring,
Mhm.
and I believe if I can get the image up right now, is what was it again? I'm getting up. Give me 1 second. Is his chasuble, because his chasuble has changed a lot, and the sedia gloria as well, the papal seat. Now these these were all done to mention earlier the humanization. It was the easing of this was to bring back the image of, oh, the Pope doesn't really have a uh, temporal power as a monarch,
Mhm.
rather theological supremacy. However, I think me, Michael, and Henry could agree that the loss of reverence here and the loss of the sort of aesthetical monarchical style is what I think most Catholics are at, and why probably lots of our uh, ancestors, especially European ancestors, would look at the Pope. They would see a king. They would awe at that image, whether those be Catholic or non-Catholic alike. It sort of recaptures and secures the natural order of the Church because it allows them to see that His Holiness is someone who's important. He should be kept up above. And most importantly, he should be the one who can allow us to bless the church as our main shepherd. So I think that's really important with His Holiness being sort of that monarch image today. It's not likely that we'll get that monarchical image anymore, but I think it'd be great for it to come back, of course. I know, for example, Pope Benedict XVI, God bless his soul, of course,
Mhm.
he sort of brought back the old uh, papal monarchical features, such as the red slippers, while he didn't bring back the traditional kissing of the slippers. He he indefinitely allowed it to be normalized in Catholic culture.
Mhm. So what is the importance of like uh all these customs and the decorations and the splendor of like um, just like these aristocrat elements to the papacy. Um, what's the harm in removing those?
Well, I don't think there's no harm in removing them. I don't I don't I think a middle ground of reverence and a middle ground of humanization doesn't do bad. However, once you remove key aspects of what make the papacy, I think that's where you can get into fine line of issues. So, for example, like I mentioned, the the case with the papal tiara. Once that was removed for humanization, lots of people were under the assumption by then that the temporal authority of the Pope had been completely lost.
Mhm.
However, that would completely render null 2,000 years of theology, history, and uh, politics for the Vatican, the Holy See, and for the seat of St. Peter. So, stuff like that really, it's more of an image facade rather than a theological issue of losing the sort of relics of the church, such as the papal tiara, the slippers, and the special crozier. So that's the real issue there.
Yeah, and I think like the point of aristocrat culture is like it just raises the dignity of man. It's like modern culture, wear whatever you want, wear whatever's comfortable. It's sort of, you just see how people lower their dignity and they act accordingly.
Oh yeah, no, certainly I would agree with that. If you look at England, for example, the old aristocrats here, there's a reason why they still wear their pomp clothing, if I may add. They still wear their tweed suits like this, lovely tweed suit. They still wear their lovely cordials, of course. They still go hunting.
Big scarves and
Exactly. It's part of the tradition. It's part of their natural place in the hierarchy, really. You just can't really remove it. And that's the same thing with His Holiness and even the Curia as well. Like, you expect the cardinals, the princes of the church, really, to serve by the Pope, having their red, showing themselves as the true bastions of the church. Yet, in modern days, I've seen many cardinals actually who've just given up with their red beretta. They've thrown it out. They've thrown out their little white fluorescent sort of capes there. They've just given it up for the sake of, oh, humility, which isn't a problem, I have to add. For example, I know Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster. He does that a lot, humility. And I don't think it's a bad thing, really. He's trying to connect with the local people. Mind you, London it's not really an affluent area. So to present yourself as this, oh, big prince of the church, that wouldn't really help the cause of bringing people to the church. But at the same time, I think if you lose that sort of, I'm repeating myself here, but if you lose that essence of the aristocracy, there's no point really, because the image is gone. We're Episcopalians at this point, if you remove it. So
yeah. So to get back onto the topic, I guess, what's the difference between feudalism and distributism? I don't know if I pronounced that second term correctly, but
oh, you did, yeah.
yeah, like the ideas of Belloc and Chesterton.
Well, so actually, if I think the economic framework of the monarchy, that's a whole different issue.
Mm-hmm.
But if I want to go into it, the idea of distributism, it originally comes from the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII. It discusses the idea to be against free market capitalism naturally, because many people on the right these days, they don't realize that free market capitalism was what that destroyed the original Christian nature of Europe, because it allowed for the merchants, it allowed for the Nova Riche to come into play, rather than allowing for the old aristocrats or allow for the monarchy to have influence. I think it's a
Not to
very
mention,
oh, you
and not to
continue.
mention is no, no, you're fine. Well, not to mention as well is that the rise of the Industrial Revolution as a result of the growth of the merchant class and the free market also created a very different mindset within the conscience of the average Catholic European, because they were reprogrammed in a sense where they would basically see like work and just simply like working like every single day, like for hours without end, as like the prime like obligation that he had, you know, um, rather than going to church and praying and all doing all these other things that that was essential for a Catholic. Um, and so this reprogramming, it was like a very generational thing. Like imagine you're like a young child and growing up in like a like increasingly industrialized France, for example. Um, you saw how basically like your parents had you grow in this atmosphere where like everything is very gray, and because everybody's always focused on working and like it feels very soulless in a sense. And that sort of attitude basically like created like a sort of lukewarmness like with faith. where it just basically just became something of like being a Catholic in name only, and that simply like that grew like snowballed into like worse, something worse and worse and worse as as each generation came. And so as a result, like Rerum Novarum was simply like a reiteration of what the church had taught about economics for like its entire history, but rather applying it to a completely modern, like in a completely modern setting, as they had to like answer the questions that were brought up by um, capitalist philosophers like John, what's his name again? He wrote The Wealth of Nations. I can't remember his name.
John Smith.
Um,
Yeah,
was it John Smith? Yeah,
it
yeah.
was Smith.
Uh,
Yeah,
and also like people like you know Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And so as these philosophies were taking hold of the political scene across Western Europe, as you saw, like for example in France, where the traditional camp in the country had basically been completely overtaken by this sort of um, free market Christian democratic faction. The natural idea of economics like within that was beginning to be rejected. So the papacy had to do something to answer these sorts of questions, and so that's what we get with Rerum Novarum, which was perhaps released at the most crucial time. It was perfectly timed, and it turned out to be very, very um, it really tipped the scales of how the battle for like the country different countries like economic philosophies when as the century progressed. And we also got this reiteration with Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno. Um, no, those are my thoughts on it. You can continue, Niwa.
I know. I agree with you. I think Louis Bonald actually talks about how the Industrial Revolution destroys the family, how it allows, it changes the total landscape of how families now work because everyone's now working. There's no point of the natural family unit because of the Industrial Revolution destroying that all. Definitely links into that.
It
100%.
equalized work, so women and men could do the same work, whereas before only
Exactly.
men could do
Hmm.
most of the labor. And
Another problem that Louis Bonald did touch upon. And exactly the point that you mentioned on Reverend Navarro, that when it touches on free market capitalism, it says that it's not the answer, it only exploits people. Yet at the same time, this new idea, which has been growing in France and in Central Europe, socialism, that's not the answer as well. They've seen it, they saw it, what happened during the Second French Republic. That did not work at all. It was ghastly for
In
the
the
French
Paris
people.
Commune as well, after the
Mm,
collapse of the Second Empire.
exactly. So really, he what Pope Leo's, I think he said this himself. He said that socialism does not give the tools for man to do his own land. I'm pretty sure, for verbatim, really. But for the same time, for capitalism, rather than giving man the tools, what it does is that it gives man the same tools that everyone else has, and as a result of those tools, they're all being exploited by that one big person, by that monopoly that free market capitalism creates. So I think that's very important to mention. I think with feudalism, on the other hand, like you mentioned, feudalism is it's an ancient concept now, but back then during the medieval Christian Europe at the time, it was a commonplace economic theory, really. So feudalism, in its core root, is that the barons, the lords in the local area, they subordinate with local peasantry, and they work with well, more really, it's them telling them what to do with their land.
Mhm.
And to be honest, I think in the modern sense, it's very much like uh, a count, sort of a mayoral type of role. The mayor tells his workers what to do, and the workers do that as a result, they get food and they get accommodation. And in many cases, especially in England at the time, they had a link. The local barons would come and meet them every week, unlike other sources suggest that lords and barons only stay in their manor. I would entirely reject that because, mind you, they're working on the lords and barons' land. The lord, the lords and the barons don't want a terrible harvest. They don't want that. They don't want their land to be squandered up by the yeomen, do they? So it's natural for the lords and barons for them to look after these peasantry class, these yeomen, and for him to look after the people who are on this land. Now, I think in the modern sense, feudalism, it can be applied, but then it would need in the intricacies of feudalism would need to apply in the modern sense, and that would be really difficult, especially in such a time like Henry mentioned that uh, that the Industrial Revolution has created this sort of idea of individualism and being individualistic when it comes to our own economies. You're
Yeah.
working for yourself, you're not working for the collective. Now, some people might think I'm a communist for saying that, and you're entirely wrong because uh, it doesn't. It takes a whole, in my opinion, it takes a village to actually raise a child. It doesn't. It doesn't take the individual. You can have the autonomy of the family, yet it's the community that makes up and grows and nurtures the family naturally, and that's what we've seen through the past years and so. So that's that's my 2 cents on the matter of feudalism and distributism.
Yeah. So, where do you all think we're trending towards? Capitalism or socialism? Which one are we going full
Cool.
speed toward?
For okay, let's we'll see. Dear me. Uh, when you mean by trending, well, are you talking about how governments are approaching the economy, or
Yeah,
how?
mostly the governments.
I'm actually to the strong belief that governments are becoming much more capitalistic. You know, you see, it's a facade. I think I've mentioned this. The modernization of the economy to make it so technological has forced us to be in a capitalistic society. There's no doubt about that. I think government at this, especially like such cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, it's very hard for governments to centralize and to look at a problem such as a cryptocurrency, which is decentralized. They don't know what it is, unlike with a currency. So everything's going online. It's naturally going to be more capitalistic, and people ask for more deregulation as a result of that. So it's not going to be the best look for socialism. But at
And
the
not to
same time,
mention,
continue.
no, continue. Oh no,
I
all
was
right.
going to say, for nations such as England, where their legislation now, so our parliament, are really against Bitcoin and online currencies. So I really think the trend is just going to be UK. The UK will have the mixed economy there. They'll have a nice middle ground.
Yeah.
And not to mention as well, like in the context of the United States, what really you're seeing, like what we're seeing really, is just simply like a consolidation of corporate power within the like under the guise, under the illusion that um of like socialism and whatnot, because like all these different corporations, like as at least like over here on this side of the Atlantic, you had like in the early 2010s, you had like anti-austerity movements like Occupy Wall Street, and that kind of alerted a lot of the corporate class, like the different, you know, the corporate sector as to like they had to rebrand themselves in order to, you know, consolidate their power. And so that's why you see like all these different corporations like pushing like different liberal narratives in the media, and you know, portraying themselves as like big defenders of egalitarianism. And so as in order to kind of keep that sort of populist like in line, and you know, under the belief like, okay, yeah, we're making progress, guys, when in reality they're just simply becoming more like dragged into the sort of system that the corporate class desires. I mean, you see how like the World Economic Forum and whatnot talk about how they don't want you to own property anymore and all that sort of stuff. And
Yes.
so what you really are seeing is just like um all these different um you know factions like of the political left like just simply like believing themselves to be like winning in a sense, when in reality they're just simply falling victim to they're simply falling into the trap that the corporate class desires.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I think we strayed away from the monarchy topic once again.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I think this would be a good way to segue actually into uh, the sort of Catholic thinkers and their ideas of monarchy. So the authority, so tradition, if I'm correct, traditionally, monarchy and the papacy have gone back. So it was Saint Pope Gelasius III, I think, and his relations to the Byzantine Emperor, to how the church will have its own autonomous right in the nation, as it will give the nation salvation, and the church will obey the laws, yet it will be that authority that will be against the nation if it does natural wrong against the church. So as a result, it just grew naturally into a throne and altar sort of system, like I mentioned earlier. And it was Pope Pius VI after the martyrdom of Louis XVI that declared monarchy is the best of all governments. And certainly someone who definitely agrees with that is Joseph de Metz. Now, Joseph de Metz's theories, they all link back, I believe, to the social contract. And he believes in the monarchy because he's totally against the social contract. He argues that the social contract disobeys the natural imminent order, European order of stability, and as a result, the social contract is flawed. He says, as a nation, it has its own God-given social and historical constitution, in a rooted, in a rooted, even more secure way that Burke even argues. He argues he argues more further than the legal prescription of conservative protection of legislation. So laws to protect the monarchy, that doesn't back the monarchy in itself. The Metz argues that the God-given social and historical constitution is the reason why monarchy exists. So legal law cannot create order or ways to rather separate power. So what he says is that more imminent things such as culture, race, is is sort of linked divinely. So legislation would give structure to Christian holidays, for example, or bishops in the House of Lords in England, or the coronation in England. These are all legislation, but they all happen due to the order of means, all linking back to that God given social and historical constitution. And this is why the Met always argues that human institutions like liberal think tanks, reform banquets like you saw in France, or the Jacobins, the Freemasons, of course, could not build a direct physical lasting institution because human reason is naturally deceitful, while the monarchy is God given. Now, this so this naturally goes into the argument that institutions only last if it's God made. They are both political and religious, and they have to be accepted as sacred by the people. That's what the core argument of Joseph the Metz is. So, a friend of mine actually gave me a clear example of this, and he said during the time of the Spanish Civil War, when
Yeah.
there's Francisco Franco, there were short-term gains for the people. You know, of course, Francisco Franco got in, destroyed the communists, the liberals, the anarchists, and however, he did that through violence. And violence is contrary to God. I mean, there's a whole different argument on whether he was justified or not. But the fact is that the violence in itself did not actually change the people's mentality. Because, oh yes, you've got an autocrat in power. You've got Francisco Franco. However sort of good he may be for the Catholic Church, he uh, it's not rooted naturally. And a comment here actually prior was good. So
Mhm.
Gabriel C said organic monarchy gang, and this sort of links back to my point here is that it's not naturally rooted. Francisco Franco might be a good guy for the Catholic Church. He might have done great things to really stop liberalism growing in Iberia. But the fact is, it's not rooted naturally. He's not a natural figurehead like a monarch. So he's not innately connected and sacred to the people. And as a result, once he died, the whole
You
system
know,
through. And now you've seen in Spain today, I think it was today they legalized uh, the changing of transgender, changing of genders at 16.
yeah, yeah,
And
they actually that was yeah, I remember they were talking about something like that for a couple years now. Um, and actually, that actually makes when you talked about how the order is like the natural order of the nation is divinely given. That actually made me remember like a very good point. Um, and that I remember Charles Coulomb talked about. And that is how when he was asked how America, like in the event that America were to have a monarchy again, he talked about how um, first and foremost, the way that it doesn't work like that. It cannot be from a bottom up thing. It has to like if you look at all the nations that we have today, France, Germany, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Spain, all of these nations were founded by their monarchs, and all the subsequent culture from there came from those respective leaders. Like for example, within the context of France, you have like Clovis, the first king of the king of the
mm,
Franks. In England, you have Alfred the Great. In Scotland, you have Kenneth the First. And in Ireland, you have Brian Boru, and in Spain, like Pelagius, I could go on. And so
Mhm.
they really like if you like look at the historical, you know, the historical evidence, you'll notice that like all these nations and the subsequent culture that comes from it, like of these respective nations, can all be traced back to like the monarchs themselves, like in all the decisions they made. And so it is very you and so that kind of speaks more as to how like then that speaks more of like the natural order because everything has to come from the top to the bottom. You cannot build things from the bottom to the top. That's naturally does have it has very like weak foundations, as you mentioned with like the Jacobins and the Freemasons. That it's just simply like inevitable that it's going to like become unstable and eventually collapse into anarchy and just complete chaos. And so having said that, with the example you put of Francisco Franco, you put a very good example there because even though like he did do a lot of great things for Spain and for the church, um, at the end of the day, that never really managed to, you know, solidify. Not only because like the order of the order of things in Spain had completely like moved away from the traditional like um order that had been established by Pelagius, Saint Ferdinand, and the Catholic monarchs. Um, but it also, it was also this change was also reflected in the monarch that succeeded Franco, Juan Carlos, uh, and how he was a very liberal monarch who collaborated with socialists, communists, into bringing them into the Spanish government again. And so within the context of Spain, there's like a very like prominent example of that because by this point in Spanish history, by the time the Spanish Civil War happened, the paradigm had completely shifted because by this point, even when Spain was still a kingdom and when it wasn't a republic, it was a very liberal kingdom, like in its like institutionally speaking, which had come as a result of the Carlist, like the victory of the Isabelines, the supporters of Queen Isabella II in the Carlist Wars. And the Carlists, on the other hand, were like the defenders of the natural order that had been established throughout Spanish history. And so, with the triumph of the Isabellines, and later they would be called the Alphonsines, um, the liberal paradigm had basically taken center stage in Spanish society, and that allowed them to basically mold like the institutions and the political culture um, that from that point on. And this is actually very reflective in how they in there was a one point in Spanish history called the turno system, and which was basically a political system where literally both like parties were just simply like rotated like whenever the king felt like it, and
Mhm.
that really speaks to you about how like similar the quote unquote conservatives and the liberals were in Spain. Like they were so similar that they literally just allowed themselves to rotate because at the end of the day it was the same, like it was two sides of the same coin of the liberal paradigm that had been established once the Carlists had been defeated.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think I think going along through that, what me and Henry both mentioned, uh, it all links back to the idea that monarchies are always stable and democracies aren't always capable of counteracting the follies. So naturally, democracy, especially in a liberal republic, usually only means so good for the few at the expense of the many, and is accompanied with like the daggers of wars, internal dissension, sort of corruption, which the people under the social contract don't want. And I think the Met and many other Catholic thinkers argue that paternal hereditary monarchy is the only way to submit to authority. Uh, Louis Bonald, he argues that the sharing of power as a result of the purity of the monarchy losing power in a democracy, in a mixed constitutional monarchy, was a ludicrous idea, as the as he argued, the separation of the powers of the monarch and the state and the church tended towards anarchy, like we saw in the French. And I think that's why, of course, England passed the Parliament Act and the People's Rights Act to really, well, to be pragmatic, but at the same time, ensure that no sort of anarchy would be tended to. Now, the monarchy, he argues that the monarchy rules for the good of society and thus represents the general will. Now, thinkers like Rousseau argues that individual wills and they're all united there. The individual will is needed, and they're united in the purpose, and they aren't to consolidate the monarch, rather, as in the general will, they're there for themselves and there for the people. Now, I'll get onto it a bit later, Rousseau and like Voltaire, but I think an important thing to talk about is for us as Catholics, really, is that whether or not a Protestant monarch is acceptable for a Catholic. Uh, we touched on Charles Colomb earlier, a good friend of mine. Charles Colomb argues that uh, a Protestant monarch is basically a Catholic institution that's been overlaid with a Protestant veneer. But the nature of the institution is such that even in such case, it can bring to the fore individuals reminiscent of the Catholic forebearers. So I think to dumb it down for the viewers is that the paint. So think of a canvas and think about it in the National Gallery. The painting may be Protestant, but the frame that makes the art beautiful and makes it worthwhile is Catholic. And I
Mhm.
think what really links to this, and I think what us as Catholics can really inspire through, is that Louis Bonald links all this with the thought of King James I, the Scottish English king, who was a Protestant, of course. And the two important books that he wrote on the matter are the Basilian Doron and the True Laws of Free Monarchy. These two books, I believe, are like the sort of supply and demand of monarchical thought, really. So, Basilian Doron is the sort of the political treaty written by King James I in 1599, shortly after his ascension to the English throne, I believe. The work
Mhm.
was intended as a guidebook for his son, so and how to rule as a good king and how to run the country wisely. So the The actual book itself is divided into three parts. The first part discusses the nature of kingship and the qualities that the king should possess. The king should be virtuous, he should be wise and just, and he should govern for the good of his subjects. He emphasizes the importance of God and religion and in the life of the king. And he advises his son not to be too flattered and listen to sort of the privy council the and his courtiers, because naturally they want to influence, they want a piece of the pie, and the piece of the pie is the nation. The king has the heart at the nation, of course. Second bit of the book deals with the relationship between the king and his subjects. James himself argues that the king has the duty to protect and care for his people, and that he should rule with their welfare in mind. And he stresses the importance of law and justice, of course, and that he says to be merciful and to avoid cruelty, because that naturally does not have good. And in the second bit, he links back to the first bit and argues that the role of the church in society is to emphasize the importance not only of the king, but to emphasize Christ himself. Because after all, Christ himself has given the authority to the king to rule in hereditary nature. The third part of the book deals with the foreign policy of the king and the relationships with other kings and rulers. It just, in essence, summarizes, just really says to be careful with the dealings with other nations, seek peace when possible, and discuss the importance of the alliances of a strong military, and to avoid unnecessary war, of course. And throughout the book, James really just uses his prior experience in Scotland to use his knowledge of biblical thought, classical thought, to really back his Basilian de Romberg. And I think it's a really important piece for monarchists. The other bit now, the thing that really makes this book so worthwhile is that the true law of free monarchies discusses the divine rights of kings. And this is where the divine rights of king comes from. The divine rights of king, some may rightfully point out, it is sort of an Anglican idea, which is true. It did come from James I, but of course it did have its traditional roots to the Catholic monarchs. It naturally came through earlier, prior to the Reformation, to King Alfred of England, of course. So, and all extent, I mean, matter of fact, the absolutists, the Bourbon absolutists, they were the ones to adopt the divine rights of the king because they saw it as true and fit for purpose for France.
Not
So,
to mention also to point out the theory of divine rights, you can also make a very good argument that um, one of the best ways that you can see the theory of divine right like in full practice is with the sort of dichotomy of the Holy Roman Emperors and the papacy, because with the Holy Roman Emperors, like they have a very own theology of their own. If you look at all throughout medieval history, you'll notice that the only empire to ever exist during this period was the Holy Roman Empire. Sure, you'll have people who will talk about how, like, for example, in England there was the people historians term it the Angevin Empire, and how in Spain, like, there were the different monarchs there called themselves the emperors of all Spain. But those are simply like um, post medieval like labelings by historians. Like if you look, there was only one emperor, and that was because it was the Holy Roman Emperor was seen as like the theologically speaking as the first amongst equals, as he was the successor to Constantine, and he was and the throne was consecrated by the altar. And so, having said that, um, there's sort of there was no possibility for there to be another emperor because he was chosen by God through the vicar of Christ to be the alongside the Pope, the temporal head of
Hmm.
Christendom and the defender of the Pope. And so you'll actually see this like reflected in how for the longest time in the Mass, like when we pray for the Pope and for the bishops, there was actually not up until I believe 1955 when Pope Pius XII formally got rid of that. Up until that point, there was a part of in the Missale Romanum that actually talked about how we pray for both the Pope and the Emperor, because he was not only like no matter where you were, he was the political head of Christendom, while the Pope was the spiritual and temporal head. And
Hmm.
so I think that's like one of the best examples of how divine rights sort of expressed itself like in Catholic theology.
Not too
Yeah.
far, actually.
We
Oh,
see
sorry.
like emperors starting ecumenical councils too. Um,
Exactly. You see
yes.
like Charles V like starting the Council of Trent, for example.
Yeah.
Mm. I was going to mention, gents, that the Benarius Press and the Angelus Press, under their English missals, they have this links to my certain points about Protestant kings. They still have the veneer of Catholicism. It's still there. So in during Sunday high Latin masses, uh, under the sections after the low mass prayers in both missals, they have prayers to Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, but now it's His Majesty King Charles III. Now it's still in practice. It's still in practice rubrics. I I believe that the FSSP, the SSPX, and the ICKSP in England, they practice that tradition where they have a prayer to His Majesty the King, and as a Protestant king, yet they still recognize that he is still head politically, and he should be naturally. And it all links back sort of to the idea of King James and how his book on the true law, uh, the free law of the true law of free monarchies, that the king, the king, while not bound to the consent of the governed, is really an authority that directly comes from God, and that the source of all law is that his power to create, interpret, and enforce law. And this law should be in light to interpret the king's interests, really, and to dispense law in cases of necessity. And I feel like to go a bit off in the area, I think
Hmm.
the king naturally, we know we often see him as a figurehead today, especially in the modern world, and I think we aren't wrong to think that, but naturally our modern institutions have forced us to do that. In America, I know uh, often when you hear about king, people just say, "Oh, that's our president," but presidents,
Actually,
while they
President's Day actually today. Huh.
while naturally they're temporarily there, they're not there forever. Unlike with a king, their family is always there. They have a vested interest in the nation. They've always
Hmm.
been there. If they've always been there, and if they've always heard about it, if they've always been in the court, they've been they've been raised in a particular way to rule the nation. And I think that's the main difference with democratic politics and with monarchical politics, is that a monarchy has the intertwined idea of what the state is. A government only does things on the basis of the vote. And I think the whole whether or not Catholics should vote is a different topic. And I think I have that somewhere written down for us to discuss later on tonight.
Yeah. So what's the problem of democracy? Like you have these two political factions, the Democrats and the Republicans. Um, they're both vying for votes every 4 years. Like we're at about that halfway point right now where we see like the next election cycle already starting up. So it seems they're not able to put attention into any one thing. They're just trying to get votes the next election cycle.
Mm. I I think a good way to actually look at this is you need to see the light in democracy, and that would be Christian democracy. I know Henry touched upon this earlier, and Christian. If you don't know what Christian democracy is, Christian democracy thinking it took place during the 19th century as the Catholic Church tried to come to the terms of the ramification of the industrialization and
Hmm.
with the points of the Enlightenment, such as the emergence of liberal capitalism. So while the church did not accept the terms of democracy, it had to consolidate. It had to find a new solution. And this
And
process
so,
originated in the French Revolution. And this was to challenge sort of the church's authority, the revolution. And the Catholic Church came over time to accept the democratic political forms and to and to see the growing concerns that the unrestrained capitalism it had. It had to get involved naturally. So
and
Christian
so,
democracy,
might I add,
yeah.
um, in Christian democracy, like you pointed out, it was simply trying as a sort of trying to reconcile the two like opposing factions. And so the way you see that, the way you see that like manifests itself into the mainstream, well, it happened in like within the context of North America, within the United States, it happened very um it happened from a very early point because you see how in American politics, regardless of what party up until like very recently, like there was like an essence or like a belief that like Christianity and Christian principles were sort of intertwined with politics. And so like you see like it in the rhetoric and in sort of like the different speeches of like the presidents like throughout um the different throughout the years. And so this sort of idea of having like the Christian values, like Christian social values, while as having a secular state, that's kind of that sort of laid the inspiration for the Second Vatican Council, actually.
Mhm.
And I think Pope Benedict XVI was actually the one who pointed this out, about how America and the idea of how America was a secular state with a socially Christian society, um, kind of inspired that. And so within the European context, you see that naturally, like within the European context, you see that develop at first in Britain with like the Tories of the late 19th century and early 20th century, as they moved away from high Toryism and the divine right of kings to a more parliamentary system and simply like the bare bones. And
Mhm.
so this sort of train of thought did not actually manifest itself that much in countries like in Catholic countries, like say France, Spain, Italy, etc. Because these like the anti-liberal force within these countries was still firmly counter-revolutionary and firmly monarchist. In France, for example, you had Jean Marat, and in Spain, you had many different thinkers like Juan Donoso Cortes and many different other thinkers across Belgium, Germany, etc. And so, with the demise of many of the traditional monarchies after the Second World War, you saw how in Italy and the Balkan states, for example, like all the Catholic monarchies had been completely wiped off the map. And the ones that did remain, like only like what Luxembourg and Belgium, were just simply like irrelevant by that point. And so that left the Catholic monarchists in a position where because of the um, different ideologies of the Allied powers, they were simply pushed aside. And this was simply reinforced with the new political order, like say in France, for example, the new political order established by Charles de Gaulle, where it was like a broadly conservative, like big tent, rather than like a unified, like ideologically cohesive movement. And so this sort of Christian democracy, um, like the philosophy of Christian democracy, managed to simply to cement itself in the post-war states. Like for example, you see in Italy with the abolition of the Savoyard monarchy and the rise of the Christian Democrats in the aftermath of the 1948 election with Alcide de Gasperi, and his party would go on to play like a vital role in Italian politics for the rest of the century. And so in like cases like these were basically laid as like textbook examples of as to how like Catholicism, like the relation between the state and the church were to be like in this like new and growing political order. And having said that, you also had like, and it did not help that the monarchs themselves that had been deposed were beginning to sort of like get comfy, like in this sort of like new order, as like for example Otto von Habsburg, the successor to Blessed Karl of Austria, God bless his soul. Um, actually began like he renounced like his any interest in having in wanting to reclaim his throne, and so as a result he pursued a political career in Austria and eventually in the European Parliament, and he was one of the main proponents of the project of the idea that was the European Union. And so the fact with the destruction left in Europe with the Second World War and the pushing aside of these traditionalist movements, um, and the rise of like new political blocs and the just overall apathy had but deposed royals mixed in with with the new American influence coming into the continent, and these ideas of like secularism with a social Christian society just laid the perfect like groundwork for the um, current state of conservative parties in many different countries, like for example, in France and Spain and whatnot.
Yeah.
Mm. I think linking to that, Saint Pius X, he said that uh, the errors naturally by any democracy is that there's a danger that is all greater when religion is associated with a kind of democracy whose doctrines are false. Now, we can see that today with many sort of political politicians in the US who claim to be Christian, claiming to fight for the Christian right, whatever it may be, yet they it all falls short really. It's it's
Mm.
based on a false premise, democracy. Well, that's what the church has always argued. That's what St. Pius X has argued. If democracy as a whole is based on a false premise, democracy can be wrong. So, for example, if people are voting for the idea for quote unquote women's rights, but in reality, this woman's right is an abortion,
Hmm.
that's a false premise of democracy. And that is something that we shouldn't have, really. It's a rapid view of authority upon which, in the eyes of many, that the church should have a social magisterium to denounce against, such as abortion. It's a rapid view of authority saying that the people should vote in order to change this view, when in reality, traditionally clericalism, that the union of the church will have that view. Now, this comes into the main segment that I wanted to get into really.
Yeah.
Why should Catholics engage in the democratic system then? And I think there's a wonderful article by the Angelus Press on this that summarizes well. Uh, I've got some notes on it. So the the actual article itself, it highlights modern democracies based upon the false liberal principles of human freedom, like I mentioned earlier with St. Pius X, which rejects all objective divine and moral law. However, it suggests that the Church nevertheless binds us to contribute towards the common good of society by an obligation of legal justice. So, to take a quote from the article here, the principle is expressed by Pope Pius XII to discuss the discourse to Italian Catholic action. He states that the people are called on to take an always larger part in public life of the nation. This participation brings with its grave responsibilities, hence the necessity for the faithful to have a clear, solid, precise knowledge of their duties in the moral and religious domain, with respect to their exercise of their civil rights, and in particular to the right to their vote.
Hmm.
So, in this situation, Pope Pius XII argues, so as we know, 1945, straight after World War II, 1946, the communists are rising.
Hmm.
So, as a result, Pope Pius XII prudently argues that everyone should know the theological responsibilities here when voting. You know the moral views, you Italian Catholics. You know what religious domain that the church holds. Exercise your civil right of voting correctly. Now, The article also touches on something that fascinates me a bit, and that's the sections of, oh, the two of the lesser two people. There's actually a funny meme, I believe. Should I vote for Moloch or should I vote for Baal? So it's actually that argument which the Anxious Press touches upon. And it says, in such a case, there can be no obligation to vote. That's what the Anxious Press says. For all the reasons mentioned by Pope Pius XII, that could no longer apply. Nevertheless, it is still permissible to vote in such a case, provided that one can be sure that there truly is a lesser evil, and that there is a grave reason to do so. So, example, to avoid abortion on demand, and to promote the unnatural methods of birth control. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, such as condoms, of course. And one has the good intention, of course, of providing the good of society as the best one can. And the Angelus Press describes this as material corporation. However, the one thing that they mainly argue is that this cannot be forced upon this voting. It's not obligatory. It's up to the prudence of the individual, of the Catholic, to say, will this actually happen if I vote for this one person? So I would say, for before people jump the gun, they say, oh, why did Catholics vote for Donald Trump? I mean, in all fairness, he was the one who overturned Roe v. Wade. And if it wasn't for Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton would have done much worse. So, under that assumption, under the prudence I've just given, perhaps it may be correct. But I think one criticism to that, in my opinion, is that if it's up to the individuals, naturally, we as Catholics, we don't have a voting bloc. Naturally, our voting bloc as traditional Catholics have been dispersed, really. So, as a result, one individual might be, oh, I'm going to vote Donald Trump, big up Donald Trump, or something like that. And then the other might abstain from voting, saying, oh, politics is all a lie, I'm going to live in the woods. So, in reality, it's going to be very difficult for us. As we know, the modern world is really against Catholicism. Modernism is in place already. So, I'm to the strong opinions, such as organizations like, I believe, Catholic Vote, isn't it? Where they persuade people, oh, you've got to look at the correct things. You've got to vote for the objectively correct one, correct Catholic candidate. So
Yeah,
stuff
not
like
to mention, like
really,
with
really helps.
Catholic vote. Yeah, exactly. I mean, with Catholic vote, for example, it's probably like a very good example. Um, in fact, at least within the context of America, they're a very good example of like what Pope Pius XII talked about, like in perfect, like it's a very perfect example of that because unlike other people who try to argue to vote for like a lesser of two evils, like um you know, what Catholic Vote tries to do is that they basically like promote and like lift up like authentically Catholic candidates who will fight and work for like at least getting at least 1 millimeter like one very small inch closer to the social reign of Christ, right? And so I think that in those concept like in that sort of context, that can be a very good way as to what how Catholics can organize themselves. If you don't want to vote, then well, fine. I mean, that's you're not under, you know, you're not morally wrong for doing so. But if you seek to sort of change the political system, like via the rules, and you don't want to compromise on your principles and on your religion, that is perhaps the most effective and authentic way you can do it.
So, do y'all know the statistic about like what percent of Catholics vote Republican or Democrat? I would assume it's more Catholics vote Republican, but I also believe there's a large Democrat vote as well. Like just look at JFK or Biden, both
I
Democrat.
think I think that when it comes to that, I have very mixed opinions on that because like what exactly are we like I think the question would be like what exactly are we counting as Catholic here? For
Exactly.
example, I mean, I think that would have to be like the deciding question. Like for example, if we're just simply like considering like everyone who is simply baptized Catholic, then I think you're probably going to get a very mixed bag there, especially considering how you can talk about how, lukewarm Novus Ordo Catholics are more open to having positions of being like open to things like contraception, abortion, gay marriage, etc. And so, having said that, like that would like being like it would be these people would be inclined to having more liberal beliefs and all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, if you're like more actively practicing, if you're like a more like if you're more devout in your faith, and you really like you like attend church, like you attend mass like every Sunday and receive the sacraments frequently and are well have like at least like a very like have like a basic understanding, at least like as far as a layman can have, of like the faith and whatnot, then yes, of course, I think in that case you would be more inclined to vote for more conservative candidates. So really, I think at the end of the day, I think it would have to be um, what exactly you call Catholic, because for example, like in the case of JFK and whatnot, he was kind of like he although he was a a Catholic candidate and like the first Catholic president, at least like during his presidency, um, he made a very like he said something that was very crucial and it had very horrible consequences politically speaking for Catholics, and that basically he tried to argue that even though yes it is true that he is a Catholic, he is a practicing Catholic, that he does not let his religion influence his politics,
Mm.
and that statement alone like um sort of caused like a very huge backfiring like of American Catholicism, because at this point in American history you had like everything was looking there was like a springtime in the church in America, and like you were having like tons of vocations, new like baptisms, like and conversions, like every single year. The
Mhm.
culture itself was like going in a very like Catholic direction, and this because like this was perfectly embodied and by people who like people in the clergy, like for example, Cardinal Spellman, who was the Archbishop of New York, who might I add was he was actually a monarchist and he denounced like the Spanish Republic and was a very open supporter of Francisco Franco. And also, you had people like Cardinal Spellman, you had Fulton Sheen, who had a very close and warm relationship with the House of Habsburg. In fact, I think he he wed like one of Blessed Carl's like children, I believe. Um, and you also had Father Coughlin, who was perhaps like he was called the radio priest, and he had like millions and millions of viewers like every single day, like or listeners, my bad. They had listeners like every single day in America. Like literally, you would walk like in throughout like neighborhoods, like Catholic neighborhoods, like in Chicago, New York, etc. Like you just walk around and you'd probably hear like from many different houses like the voice of Father Coughlin like on the coming on the radio. And so everything was looking up like that America like was seemed like um it was going to be like fully Catholic. Like, and JFK should have been the natural like conclusion to that, just as how in Rome, the natural conclusion of the growth of the faith was with Constantine. And so like after that, there was like a big like, um solidification of the faith, like within the institutions. JFK was supposed to be like the natural conclusion to that. However, he made one big mistake, and that is that he denounced the idea that that your personal faith and your politics have to be like intertwined. And so that actually, that backfired massively. And so that as a result, like many Catholics, um, and not to mention with like the onset of the Second Vatican Council and like the general like um easing of like different laws, like even like in day-to-day life, like with fasting and whatnot. After that, because of like the right when we like the momentum was like reaching its natural conclusion, it abruptly stopped. All the progress that was made in America by that point just collapsed. And so,
Mm.
in fact, when JFK actually talked about this, many people in the clergy were so terrified by this that even the very famed Cardinal Spellman, who might I add, like he was so popular like in the political scene that literally like he was like taking a picture with this very holy cardinal was enough to like literally win, like make you win an election. Like um he actually denounced John F. Kennedy, and as a result, he endorsed Richard Nixon, who wasn't Catholic. And so, but yeah, overall, you see that, because of the in America, that separation between faith and politics, that's why you see that the Catholic vote in our country has been super divided as a result.
And I found an infographic here. You can see
There
that
you
it
go.
actually leans Democrat. 44%
Mm.
voting Democrat are being affiliated with the Democrat Party. I guess that's the registered voters. Then only 37% Republicans,
I
19%
suppose
middle.
I suppose most of this has to do uh, with most of these surveys. They conclude that if you're baptized, you're a Catholic. They don't take into account whether or not you're practicing. So in such cases, of course, so states like New York, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, where predominantly New England, they're predominantly Catholic. Matter of fact, if you look at demographic maps of the predominant religion, New England is heavily Catholic. Yet, as you may know, for the past 50 years, aside from anomalies such as 1984 with the Reagan election, all of them have been Democrat. Because whether that be through a tribal link of, oh, my father's voted Democrat, my father voted him for him, my grandfather voted for Democrat because Al Smith, whatever it is, it's sort of, it all links back to, uh, it's always been a practicing thing for these areas to be Democrat. So I think while it might not show the reception of theology or the reception of the practicing nature of Catholics voting, it shows the much bigger picture of a problem of democracy, I have to add. It shows that people are more inclined to vote for the way of their tribal mentality and they aren't going to vote based on their convictions, which I think is a problem. Naturally, I think the story of JFK, Henry, that you mentioned, is a strong objection to JFK naturally as a Catholic, because you'd wonder with such politicians that they need to have the prudence to execute their faith correctly, and to simply
Mhm.
outright say, my faith is not important with this politics, thus I'm not going to have it. It's going to be to the sideline. That completely
Yeah.
removes the idea of having a faith, because your faith is at the forefront center of it. It's
And
like
I've heard Joe Biden say the same exact thing.
Not to
exactly.
mention, not to mention actually, speaking on the topic of uh this sort of tribalism like within American Catholics and like for example like voting for the Democratic Party. In fact, during the election of 1884, like the Republican candidate accused the Democratic Party of being the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Funnily enough. I mean, if that's really, I mean, if that's what it stands for, then I'm all for it. But whatever.
The party of Romanism, literally. So true. If you have time, actually, I want to. I think what's very important, a good topic actually, I want to talk about is Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and his thoughts on monarchy. So,
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
so
Perfectly laid out in De Regno,
yeah,
which I think that was written for the King of Cyprus, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
yes. So, I'll touch on that actually. So, Aquinas is very much a double-edged sword when it comes to the monarchy. So, I think he argues that the unity of peace of a regime is better governed rather than by work. So, wait, let me rephrase that. So, the
Mhm.
unity of peace. So that would mean that a regime governed by one person is better than many, because as a result of the many, you're not going to have unity of peace. You're going to have internal infighting. whether that be like in Britain, where you have the cabinet fighting about policies on immigration or refugees. Under a king or a monarch, it's all united under the unity of the peace. The king has the final say. So, for this end, it is very much secured for a single wise authority to have to not have the burden by having to deliberate with others who may be less wise or who may stand in the way of effective governance. This is what Aquinas really argues, that unity of peace is needed, and as a result, the king in his material form is this. So he goes further as well, saying that any governing body comprised of many must always strive to act as one in order to move the regime closer to the intended goal. So this is where he brings in sort of natural law. So as you may know, natural law has the 5 levels, of course. So secular law, natural law, the higher laws like divine law, dogmatic law, and all that. So
Mhm.
he argues that secular law has to go to that natural law. It has to go to the intended goal of natural law. And I think what he was really trying to argue is that the less perfect regimes, such as democracy, as a result of trying to go to this natural law, they become a monarchy. They imitate a monarchy to come to a unanimity of the rule, to realize at once that there has to be no obstruction. This is what he says to on his book on kingship, that democracies naturally become monarchies because they realize it once they're confined by this, they'll do what's best, and that best is coming together to that one goal of natural law. And that will eventually make you hereditary. Well, it will come to a sense of a monarchy. It doesn't need to be hereditary at this point. So he makes a very strong case of monarchy Aquinas. However, like I mentioned earlier, there is a double-edged sword with St. Thomas Aquinas. He argues that, as you know, with many cultures, such as in non-European cultures, so let's take, for example, actually, no, if you want to look at it,
It's like
most
Japan, for
have
example.
been monarchy. Yeah, they've all been on. So I think, what does he say? Aquinas says that a monarch is not always viable in political societies, and even where a king is available in it, it is not guaranteed that the conditions will be right to grant him the political authority that he would wield. So it wouldn't, rather, it would be more like the idea of Burke's legislative conservative idea rather than divine like the Mets. So
Mhm.
you wouldn't a king in some political societies may not have the political authority to wield that authority. So even worse, he might not even listen to the ideas of King James I, and he might become a tyrant. He might be like, I believe it was King Philippe the Fourth or the Sixth. Please correct me, Henry. Where he killed the Templars because he needed money. He hated the Pope as well. That one. He might be a tyrant and he might abuse the
Yeah,
papacy.
I, yeah, there's a yeah, you can find like many different examples of like that where they try to like appropriate like the church for their own means. Like even like for example within like the King of France, like there were multiple French monarchs, like you pointed out, the one who destroyed the Templars. Um, um, there was one who actually um, you know, you'll notice that there's like this trend where like they'll try to appropriate like ecclesiastical matters into their own hands. Like for the longest time, you had like the heresy of Gallicanism, which is simply like is the natural product of rejecting that sort of duty that you have towards the church, and you become tyrannical in that sort of sense.
Yeah.
It, and I think what Aquinas argues after all this, he says, as a result of some bad situations of a monarch, he argues that uh, political rule needs to be decentralized. So he argues for local elections, so local authority is elected. So, for example, like justices of peace or like local mayors to rule over while such bad is happening. There's a specific term for this. I forgot what the term was, where it's decentralized yet it's very traditional. What is it? Georgianism or Georgianism?
I'm not
Or
entirely sure.
it's it's sort of that someone said that once, I think, but it sort of links with that whether to have local elections, localism, in that sense, or just outright just remove the king.
Hmm.
What Aquinas really argues. So, what are your thoughts on that, guys? Henry or Michael?
Well,
Henry?
well, you can go first, Michael.
Oh, I don't have anything smart to say on that topic. I'm not learned
Well,
enough.
well, yes. I mean, within I totally agree. I mean, within the context within that sort of context where, you know, you have like a tyrannical monarch, obviously, like you have, like, it is very prudent to have like very like local officials, like justices of the peace and whatnot, to basically like try and maintain order at the local level as like, the monarch like engages like in his despotism. And actually like in this sort of context, you see like in the Holy Roman Empire, you had like whenever the monarch, the emperor, went had just like a phase of despotism, um, the princes would basically like rebel against him as a result in order to preserve the peace within the empire. And so when all that was said and done, they would just simply like the different electors, the imperial electors would elect a different one in order to ensure that there is like peace and stability within the empire. And actually, somewhat related, but we got a question in the chat. S- the, this person asked, who stands up for monarchy today, especially Catholic monarchy?
Oh, well, we do. We stand. But no, there are many good uh, monarchist thinkers today. I mean, even like ones that you might not know. So, for example, we know the obvious Charles Cologne, great guy, of course. I like to call him the father of wisdom, the only living soul that has wisdom left in him. So, of course, that's one good thing. I think other thinkers as well. Peter Kreeft, he's a good Catholic thinker. He's done a few
Yeah.
books on Aquinas.
I
He's
actually
a
met him last Friday. He gave
lovely.
a talk in Louisville. I shook his hand. I told him a funny story about how he stole an idea I had for a book. Um, in brief, I guess, not to get sidetracked, but
Yeah, Connor. So, which idea was it? Wait.
I don't know what the book was called, but it's the one where JFK, C.S. Lewis, and Aldous Huxley all died on the same day, November 22nd.
Oh, that is actually that's smart. That is.
Yeah, and so I was like, that'd make an interesting book, putting all of that together, kind of people coming in from different paths of culture and society at the time. And I told him that, and he was like, I forget what he said, but somebody else had the idea, like back in the 80s or whatever, when he wrote it. Um, one of his colleagues or something said he also had the idea, but Mr. Kreeft wrote it in 3 days, I think. He wrote the entire book in 3 days.
Wow.
So,
That's
Well,
splendid.
what in terms of like who stands up for Catholic monarchy today, like throughout the West, throughout the Western world, you can find many different groups who like you of course have like the many like series of thinkers, like you can go like um you can go from many different people um who are like very wonderful like writers and defenders of the philosophy of monarchy. But also you can look at different groups as well. Like for example, in France, you have the Action Française. It's the oldest monarchist organization in the country. They're still pretty active. Um, the King of France, actually, at least the heir to the French throne, Louis Alphonse, or more formally Louis the 20th, he's still super active in France. Like recently, he organized like a requiem mass for Louis the 16th. Um, in Spain, for example, you have the Traditionalist Communion. They do tons of wonderful like activities like pilgrimages and marches and rosary rallies. They've actually have like endorsement from the church hierarchy actually from the I'm pretty sure like at one of their processions they had they were being accompanied by is that His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider.
Mm.
He's like a big patron of them, from my understanding.
I
Um,
was going to mention him as well. Anthony Schneider, he attends lots of Habsburg events. I believe he went
yep.
to the Habsburg event in Texas, where,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I forgot what her name was. Henry.
The Blessed Carl Symposium. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is
Yes.
also a very good example of
Mm.
monarchist activity within the United States. If you're very interested in that, it's a very good. And honestly, to be honest, like within like American circles, the best places you can look for like to meet in like chats with fellow monarchists and like like organize things is really at your local parish. That's probably the best
Yeah,
chance you got, like especially now that in America, like many of traditional Catholics are looking more towards like studying more the different tenets of monarchy, especially now with the growing devotion to Blessed Karl of Austria. Actually, I think very, very soon, actually, there's going to be a symposium for his wife, Empress Zita, actually. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely attend there. I think Charles Coulomb is actually a confirmed speaker at the event.
Mm.
But yeah, you see many different traditional like Catholic like authors and whatnot, like even like the more famous ones like Dr. Taylor Marshall have also been very open to the idea of monarchy and whatnot, and the people over at 1 Peter 5 and whatnot. Um, and really, you see that it's looking very good. The future for monarchist movements in Western Europe, without question, the situation is very, very good for them. You can find many different
Mm.
organizations over there, and I think in Britain, you guys have many different high Tory groups that,
Of
um,
course, yeah.
yeah, and so in America, like it's looking to be like things are looking up very good. If I think that with if we do more events like surrounding like Blessed Karl of Austria, that could basically pave the way for a more unified consensus as to what direction traditional Catholics should take for the future of the country. Whether like I mean, that's not to say that like like we're like completely dead set on like having a Habsburg monarch in the country, but like having a monarch who is like him in a sense. Um, and really like I said, if you want to um chat and link up with fellow monarchists, like Catholic monarchists, really like the best way to do it is at your local parish. That's the best advice I can give to anybody. What would you say, Limbo?
I want to add on for that. I totally agree with you. At your local parish, I think, especially at your local Latin masses as well, where people are
Hmm.
more likely to want tradition. Of course, they're more likely inclined to that. I had a conversation actually with one of my good friends who went to the March for Life. One of them, I think it
Yeah.
was in DC, wasn't it?
Yes.
And she was saying actually that the turnout this year was strong. However, you can sense the aura that it was mostly Catholics this year.
That's
People
right.
from their understanding that, oh, Roe v. Wade has been done, it's finished. No, it's the fight is still to continue, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So from such activities like those, honestly, I think it shows a parallel there to say that for us as Catholics, we sort of need to unite in that issue. And whether or not people say, oh, it's like, oh, remove democracy and what? We aren't going to have the non Catholics just disappear. We ought to really just have, for us as Catholics, to have a united body, like I mentioned earlier, to really solidify our position and to really promote the monarchist idea. Now, I know for Americans, they really hold the idea of liberty, the and for their own individualism. And for me, while I may object to that, I think one important thing we can agree on is that the effective worker governance is needed, whether that be in
Hmm.
the United Kingdom or whether that be in the United States of America. It is us as Catholic men actually to actually fight for what is right for our forefathers and right for the next generation of Catholics, of course. So
That
if
actually leads me to a very interesting point, actually. Within the context of the United States, I think that um, one very good example of how that course can look, you can look no further to countries like Poland and Hungary as the first step in the right direction. Obviously, like Viktor Orban and whatnot, and I forget the name of the guy in Poland. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Duda and like
Yeah,
recent,
Duda,
oh,
Andrzej Duda. I don't know. Um, Even you can probably point out like different, like they're not perfect, but the culture they have created in their respective countries has basically paved the way for there to be a restoration of like the monarchy in those certain countries. Actually, I think Charles Coulomb himself actually pointed this out, is that these like the countries that are most likely to bring back monarchies within like or at least like in our lifetimes are probably those two countries because the Catholic republics are just simply the natural monarchy is just simply the natural conclusion to these different forms of government. It either ends up being a liberal republic like Ireland, or it ends up taking a more monarchical path, which is what's happening in Hungary. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, actually, the House of Habsburg themselves are actually statistically speaking more popular than Viktor Orban himself, funnily enough. Um, and in Poland, there's a lot of in Poland you have traditional Catholic movement there has completely solidified itself, at the local level, and I remember reading about this a long time ago. I'm pretty sure that all both of you have seen the very famous picture of that kid in Poland who was lifting up the crucifix in front of
Yeah.
yeah,
a pride. You know that he's actually he's like a seminarian now, and I think he's going to be celebrating when he gets ordained, he's going to be celebrating the traditional mass for the Society of St. Pius X. Um, and but yeah, like I said, I mean, these countries have created the perfect political climate for the topic of monarchy to eventually come to be forefront of the national debate and conversation within those countries. And if in America, where we're very at the very least now we're very entrenched in the Republican system, and where liberty is treated as a dogma of the state, simply trying to you know make turn the political climate in that direction, which fortunately we have a growing amount of people who are open and susceptible to that form of thought. Actually, I think a very recent poll showed that 20% of Americans now believe that that this that um Christianity should be enforced like as the law of the land. And of course, you'll have the non-Catholics pushing for this stuff, like the evangelicals. But it's a very promising statistic because that allows for space to grow and eventually consolidate the aforementioned two countries, Hungary and Poland. So overall, it's looking very it's looking very promising, and there's many different, there's a lot of stuff to do and a lot of stuff to get done, but ultimately, it's looking very promising. But we have to continue praying for all this sort of stuff.
I think
of
that's a
course.
good note to end on, unless you have anything to add, Niwa.
Oh no. I think well, actually, one final bit. We
Yeah,
need to
go ahead.
counter the revolution. To counter the revolution, you need to create a culture, and whether that culture just might be just starting a religious solution, like to back our aristocrats in England, back our clergy, make a common cause, and that common cause will be for the monarch. I think it's that simple, really. If you argue for the truth, religion, and if that all is intertwined with our politics, I think the demise will come back as a phoenix naturally, and the unimpaired restoration of sort of the an old regime will happen naturally. It will naturally come about, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion. So the counter revolution is starting. I mean, the
And
counter
Charles
was
Coulomb
there,
actually,
done.
and Charles Coulomb pointed out something very interesting, and that I think he actually did. He actually talked about this. I think he mentioned this to you, Niwa. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
that when Voltaire, like, if you want to look at it from the like opposite side, um, when Voltaire died, he was like basically a nobody. He died a nobody, and a lot of his ideas by the time of his death were just simply forgotten about. Basically, no one really cared. Funnily enough, even Mozart of all people like made
Yeah,
fun of
I
him when he
was about
died.
to mention that.
But I
So
mean,
right.
I mean, if you look at it today, like his philosophy has completely prevailed. So it really starts off like that. And like when he died, like nobody thought that his train of thought was going to reach the prominence that it reaches today. And so in our case, that's the same way. Like a lot of
Mm,
people might not think that it's going to go anywhere, but who knows? Like in this is probably not something that we're going to see in our lifetimes, you know, but long time from now, like, you know, if we continue praying, like, everything will turn out all right.
of course.
We get the
Mhm.
desired outcome.
It takes time for seeds to grow.
Smart.
It's a good tree, but um,
Oh,
I had
Yeah,
to.
the same
no,
out. Like, bro got the same,
bro.
Same.
setup with Michael Lofton. It's so over. We're gonna get like a video done like that.
No, a
Michael
reason,
Two
Lofton is
Michaels.
free right now.
reason the theology is going to come at us. He's going to, Big Man Lofton is going to do a video why democracy rules at this point.
Be charitable, guys.
Char-
Be
char-
nuanced.
charitable discussions, of course.
Of course.
Yep. So where can the viewers find y'all?
Well, they can. Well, I'm sure my old YouTube account's still on. I'm planning to probably make content again. I'm a bored man, so
Mhm.
I think I'll do more interviews this time around. They can find me on my socials on Discord, or whether that be even like Instagram now. I don't really mind. So, yeah.
And
Yeah,
I'll
I
put
mean, in
all
my
that in the
case,
bio. But yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Henry.
my case, well, I mean, I'm relatively new to this, so what I'm probably gonna do, well, what I will do, I'm gonna start, writing articles for Catholicism for the modern world, and you're definitely gonna find me on there.
Hmm.
I have social media, I have Instagram, but admittedly, like, I'm, you know, I'm not gonna be active there for like the next month. Um, but yeah, like I can, I have a Discord. You could probably like reach out to me there, like if you want to, like if anybody's interested in talking. So
I think the
yeah, I mean,
viewers liked you, Henry. We have a couple of comments here. Let Henry speak.
Okay.
I should let Henry speak.
This is the goofy com. I know who this is.
I was kind of holding in a laugh. I just saw that. Um, keep talking, Henry. We want that. Good. But,
so yeah,
yeah, I think that about does it. Any
Cool.
last any
No.
last words?
Well, my last
We
was
roll the outro.
God, King, Country. I'm out.
Amen.
Like the eternal city that is Rome, where the ecclesiastical splendor of the Renaissance completely enthralls the imagination.